Did that eat up all my time? Did I give you that? I don't know. That feels really awkward. um, so hi, I'm Jen, and actually really excited to be here, and wanted first to just acknowledge and honor the land and the people of the land that we're on, that we're meeting on, and that's the Mississaugas of New Credit, and also acknowledge and honor all the Indigenous people living in this area in Toronto. It's quite a diverse Indigenous population living here now. And I also, I'm here talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, and I'll tell you what that is, and reasons why it helps to create a path. It sometimes sounds scary to people, but really it helps guide a path in many ways. So I'll start by acknowledging where I come from and my family. And one of the ways that I've learned to introduce myself is that I'm Jennifer, and I come from the waters of Julia. That's my mother there, who comes from the waters of Margaret, who's my grandmother, who lives just outside of London, Ontario, and who comes from the waters of Helen. And these are the Mohawk line of women in my family. And in the Haudenosaunee tradition, the maternal line is really important. So I ground myself that way before I speak, especially when I'm nervous. And I anticipated being nervous. So what I wanted to talk about is to ground some of this thinking about specific populations, is to ground us in Indigenous perspectives on health and wellness, because HCV falls into a broad perspective, and to talk to you about Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous research ethics. So that's what happens when you get an epidemiologist to talk. Then I focus on data. But then also, what do population data tell us about HCV and Indigenous populations? But I want to guide the discussion a little bit and ground it in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. So what I'm finding over time is people sort of take for granted the calls to action. Maybe you all had a look at them when they were first released, or haven't really given a lot of thought into how they influence how you work and how you move within Canada. And so I will just help to make some of those connections as I go. So I really wanted to start by thinking about the complexity of health and the perspectives of health that are held in Indigenous communities. Christy Belcourt is a Métis artist, a beautiful artist and a beautiful person who's doing a lot of work to reclaim well-being in land-based ways. And what she said about this piece of art resonates with me when I think about wellness. And it says, she said, all species, the lands, the waters are one beating organism that pulses like a heart. We're all part of a whole. So, I acknowledge the talk this morning that said, we need to be looking at many different aspects because a person is a sum of its parts. And we talk about, a person in the center of a health system, and that being a sum of, and really, like when it comes to the Indigenous perspectives, we're thinking about Indigenous people and all of us being connected to land and being connected to all of the things that make us human. So that she goes on to say that when we lose touch with our connection with land and water and other organisms, then we lose our humanity. So then coming to a more researchy framework that might resonate better or worse, I'm not sure. But this is a framework for well-being that's the First Nations Information Governance Center in Canada uses to frame their regional health survey. And so they say well-being is the total health of the total person and the total environment. So thinking about that framework and Indigenous perspectives about that person being within a broader framework that includes many things, including a balance between mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional health. Another framework that's really important when we're thinking about Indigenous health and hepatitis C is the Indigenous Determinants of Health model. So we hear about social determinants of health a lot, and not if you've heard of social determinants of health. Probably pretty sure most of you have. Even when I ask undergrads, most of them have heard of social determinants of health. But really, the contemporary discussion among Indigenous scholars is thinking about determinants of Indigenous health that might go beyond those social determinants of health or may differ a little bit from those determinants of health that we are used to thinking about. And just last week, actually, one of the PhD students who's working with me, Robin Rowe, she drew this image as she was learning about and trying to process the determinants of health. And this model of a tree, and it's not a new model, it's just a beautiful image that she drew. And if we think about the leaves of that tree, it can be things like, how are people doing? Are they testing positive for hepatitis C? Those are the kinds of really visible things about a tree that you would see. And those branches leading to that tree are the really close determinants of health in terms of education, employment, social status. But then as you get down deeper into that tree and where that tree comes from, the trunk is really those determinants of health that are the structural determinants of health that the previous speaker alluded to, some of those structural determinants of health in terms of systems and how they influence people's positions in the world. And then if you think about a tree and how big and broad and expansive the tree system is, it's just as big and broad and expansive under the ground in the parts that you can't see. And so those roots are those distal determinants of health that may be further, that may not be as obvious, but those are things like colonialism and racism, the things that have for generations been influencing how Indigenous peoples interact with settler society. And so those things are not things that can be ignored when we think about really working in contexts where we're talking about even doing research or designing policy or care or recommendations that will influence a disproportionate number of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So we can't forget that what the data has shown us so far is that we do have higher proportions of people in Indigenous communities who test positive for hepatitis C, and so